The cameras were already rolling when Ron DeSantis leaned forward, his voice carrying that familiar edge of smugness. He smirked, pausing just long enough to make sure the microphones caught every syllable. "You know," he said, gesturing toward Jasmine Crockett, "it's funny how someone with that kind of past thinks they can lecture the rest of us on leadership." The words hung in the air like smoke after a firecracker, loud, sharp, impossible to ignore. The audience shifted uncomfortably. A few gasps rippled through the room. Even seasoned reporters exchanged quick glances, as if silently asking one another the same question. Did he really just say that? DeSantis sat back in his chair, confidence radiating like he'd just delivered a knockout punch. To him, it was a calculated move, the kind of casual cruelty that could get clipped into a soundbite and fed to his base. He let the silence linger, believing it was his moment to dominate. But the silence wasn't comfortable. It was suffocating. It pressed against the walls of the room, against the faces in the crowd, against every beating heart watching the spectacle unfold. For a long breath, no one moved. The camera zoomed in on Crockett, capturing her expression. Waiting to see if she would flinch, she didn't. The stillness became its own kind of tension, the sort that makes you lean closer to the screen, unable to look away. DeSantis's grin widened, certain that his barb had landed exactly where he wanted it to. Yet in that moment, the story had already started to slip from his grasp. Because the insult wasn't just about Crockett. It was about everyone who had ever been told their past made them unworthy. Anyone whose struggles had been weaponized against them. And in a room full of cameras, that kind of cruelty doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Viewers at home would rewind this moment, replay it, dissect it, rage about it. Social feeds would clip it, quote it, turn it into headlines before the night was over. But what no one realized, not the moderators, not the audience, not even DeSantis himself, was that this insult wasn't the end of a story. It was the spark, and what Jasmine Crockett did next would leave Ron DeSantis silent. And an entire country watching in disbelief. The moment DeSantis's words hit the air, the confrontation shifted from a petty insult to something much larger. It was no longer just a sparring match on stage. It was a test of values, a mirror held up to America. Because in that instant, millions watching knew this wasn't simply about Ron DeSantis mocking Jasmine Crockett's past. It was about whether dignity could survive in the face of arrogance. DeSantis wanted to brand the exchange as a power play, the kind of move that cements dominance and forces opponents into silence. But to those watching, especially those who had been dismissed or belittled because of where they came from, his words carried a sting far deeper than politics. They were a reminder of how quickly identity, struggle, and history can be twisted into weapons. This wasn't new for Crockett. She had faced condescension before. But the stakes here were higher, amplified by the cameras, the headlines, the thousands of eyes in the room, and the millions more waiting to scroll through their feeds. Every second of hesitation, every flicker of emotion would be clipped and shared, turned into a narrative she might never control, and that's exactly why the tension was unbearable. Everyone knew the weight of what had just been said. Reporters scribbled notes with frantic hands. Pundits watching remotely were already drafting talking points. DeSantis's supporters might cheer the jab, but the country as a whole was bracing itself for the response. Would Crockett crumble under the weight of mockery? Would she lash out and give DeSantis more ammunition? Or would she rise above? The silence in the room magnified the stakes. Crockett's pause wasn't weakness, it was suspense. Like a skilled fighter, she was letting her opponent think he had landed the first blow, while quietly positioning herself for the counterstrike. And for an audience hungry for authenticity, hungry to see someone stand tall in the face of smugness, that pause became electric. Because the truth was, this wasn't just a debate. It was a cultural collision. On one side, a politician embodying arrogance, leaning on ridicule to score cheap points. On the other, a woman who had built her career on resilience, representing millions who refused to be defined by their struggles. The drama of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. Commentators would later call it the turning point, the instant where an insult meant to humiliate began to unravel into something far greater. Social media users would describe the tension as unbearable, like watching a fuse burn toward a stick of dynamite, and that dynamite was about to go off because what DeSantis had failed to realize was that Mocking someone's past doesn't erase their strength, it sharpens it. And Crockett, with every ounce of composure in her being, was about to remind him, and the country, that dignity isn't just a word. It's a weapon. The stakes had been set. The crowd could feel it. The nation could feel it. And in the growing anticipation, one question echoed louder than all the rest. How would Jasmine Crockett answer back? Ron DeSantis didn't stumble into this moment by accident. He had spent years cultivating a reputation as the man who wouldn't back down, the fighter who thrived on confrontation. From press conferences to rallies, his playbook rarely changed. Find an opponent, mock them, diminish them, and walk away with a smirk that told his supporters he had won. To some, it was sharp political theater. To others, it was cruelty dressed up as confidence. Long before he ever squared off with Jasmine Crockett, DeSantis had been testing the limits of ridicule as a political weapon. He mocked journalists during briefings, belittled colleagues on the debate stage, and leaned into a style that blurred the line between governance and showmanship. His defenders claimed it was toughness, a willingness to tell it like it is. But to those who watched closely, it was clear the act wasn't about strength, it was about control. That night, as he leaned back in his chair after firing off his jab at Crockett, DeSantis believed he was simply doing what had always worked. He saw the pause in the room as proof that his words had landed. He had no reason to think otherwise. This strategy had carried him far. But the story of DeSantis is a story of contradictions. And those contradictions are what made his arrogance so glaring in that moment. On one hand, he marketed himself as a disciplined leader, a man of order and control. On the other, he repeatedly sought chaos because chaos was where he thrived. His rise was fueled not by building coalitions but by tearing others down. Every victory speech carried the undertone of a fighter who didn't care if the crowd was cheering for him or against the person he just humiliated. As long as the spectacle was remembered, the mission was accomplished. It was a strategy born in a political climate hungry for conflict. The louder the clash, the more headlines followed. And DeSantis knew how to play that game better than most. But arrogance, when repeated too often, begins to calcify. It becomes predictable. It convinces its bearer that no one can stand against it, and that's exactly where his miscalculation began. By mocking Crockett's past, he thought he was reaching for an easy target. He assumed her story, the challenges, the setbacks, the resilience, would fold under pressure when dragged into the spotlight. He thought he could reduce her to a caricature, a soundbite, an object of scorn. What he didn't account for was how many people saw themselves in her story. That's the fatal flaw of arrogance. It blinds. DeSantis didn't see the risk of turning her past into a weapon because he didn't believe it carried any power. But to the millions of viewers watching, immigrants, working-class families, women who had clawed their way into rooms they were never expected to enter, her past wasn't a weakness. It was a badge of honor, and so, as he sat there, relishing in what he believed was a moment of dominance, the seeds of downfall were already being planted. His smirk was the same one he had worn countless times before, but this time the air was different. This wasn't just another target. This wasn't just another soundbite. This was Jasmine Crockett. And she wasn't going to play his game. The irony of DeSantis's rise is that it made this moment inevitable. The more he leaned into mockery as his weapon of choice, the more he set himself up to one day meet an opponent who wouldn't just survive the insult, but turn it into a mirror that reflected his arrogance back at him. That night was the collision point. His past strategy had finally met its counterforce, and as Crockett prepared to answer, every contradiction in DeSantis's carefully crafted image, his claim of discipline, his swagger of toughness, his reliance on cruelty, was about to be exposed, because arrogance, when pushed to its limits, doesn't just collapse quietly. It crumbles loudly under the weight of the truth it tried so hard to bury, and the truth in that room was about to belong to Jasmine Crockett. Long before she ever walked into that room, long before she sat across from Ron DeSantis and absorbed his smug jab, Jasmine Crockett had already lived through battles that made cheap insults feel small. Her story wasn't one of privilege or ease. It was one of climbing, of stumbling, of refusing to be defined by the weight others tried to place on her shoulders. And that's precisely why his words, meant to diminish, carried such a different resonance. She was born into a world that didn't hand her a seat at the table. Every inch she claimed had to be earned, often twice over. In classrooms, she was the girl underestimated, the one others assumed would fade into the background. In her early career, she was told, sometimes with a smirk, sometimes with silence, that people like her didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made. Each dismissal, each slight, etched itself into her memory, but instead of breaking her, it steeled her. What DeSantis mocked as a past was, in truth, a record of resilience. She had faced financial struggles, community doubts, systemic barriers that would have sent many into retreat. Yet she leaned into the very things others labeled as weaknesses. Those hardships gave her fluency in the language of ordinary people. They made her more than a politician. They made her a survivor, someone who knew firsthand the weight of being counted out and the fire it takes to rise anyway. When she became a lawyer, it wasn't because the path was easy or expected. It was because she refused to watch injustice unfold without stepping into the fight. Day after day, she stood beside clients who were mocked, marginalized, written off. People society treated the same way DeSantis had just tried to treat her. Every courtroom battle honed her presence. Every skeptical glance from across the aisle sharpened her ability to cut through arrogance with precision. Her path into politics carried the same defiance. She wasn't born into dynasties or groomed in ivory towers. She came through the trenches of community activism, local organizing, the grinding work that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. That background didn't make her soft. It made her unshakable. So when she walked into the national spotlight, she carried with her not just her own story, but the weight of countless others who saw in her journey a reflection of their own. That's what DeSantis missed. When he mocked her past, he assumed shame. But for Crockett, her past was not a chain, it was armor. It was the reason she could sit under those hot lights, hear his words, and not flinch. She had already faced worse than ridicule. She had faced poverty, doubt, barriers designed to keep her out. And every single time she had answered with persistence, with composure, with a kind of stubborn faith in her own worth. Her composure in that room wasn't just performance. It was the product of years of preparation, of moments where losing her cool would have cost her everything. It was forged in the fire of battles that demanded calm when others wanted chaos. It was honed in the grind of learning that silence, at the right moment, can be louder than shouting. And so, when DeSantis smirked and the cameras turned to her, Crockett didn't just represent herself. She represented every immigrant family told they didn't belong. Every working-class kid told their past defined their ceiling. Every woman who had been mocked in rooms full of men who mistook arrogance for strength. She sat there as the embodiment of dignity, not in spite of her past, but because of it. Her story carried a kind of inevitability. Of course she would face someone like DeSantis. Of course there would be a moment where mockery tried to reduce her. But the irony was rich. The very history he tried to weaponize was the same history that had trained her for this confrontation. It had prepared her to meet arrogance with calm, cruelty with clarity, and condescension with a counterstrike sharp enough to silence a room. This was never going to be a debate she lost. Not because she rehearsed a clever comeback, not because she was shielded by political allies, but because her entire life had been a rehearsal for moments like this. DeSantis didn't know it, but the battle he thought he was winning was already over. He was standing on a stage where his greatest weapon, mockery, was useless against someone who had transformed every insult into fuel, every dismissal into proof of her endurance. The irony was brutal. By trying to cut her down with her past, he had opened the door for her to reveal its true power. And the silence that followed his insult wasn't fear. It was the weight of a woman measuring her response, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would not just defend her, they would define her. And when she finally spoke, it would not be to play his game. It would be to rewrite it. The air in the room had thickened. DeSantis leaned back, satisfied, certain that his mockery had seized control of the narrative. The cameras were trained on Jasmine Crockett, their lenses hungry for even the slightest crack in her composure. Every twitch, every breath would be dissected, and yet she gave them nothing. Just calm eyes, steady posture, the faintest hint of a knowing smile. That restraint only made DeSantis push further. Like a schoolyard bully mistaking silence for weakness, he doubled down. "You see, folks," he continued, turning toward the moderators as though inviting them to laugh with him. "Some people think their struggles make them experts. But that's not leadership. That's baggage." He chuckled, the kind of hollow laugh meant to signal victory before it's earned. The audience shifted again, some clapping hesitantly, others murmuring with discomfort. It wasn't the raucous applause he expected. Something about his tone fell flat, but he didn't notice. DeSantis was too wrapped up in his own performance, too certain the crowd was with him. Crockett, however, noticed everything. The tightening jaws of audience members, the restless fidgeting of reporters, the way the room's energy had shifted from curiosity to unease. She sat still, letting him pile on. With each word, he was building a tower of arrogance, brick by brick, and she knew it wouldn't take much to topple it. The tension became unbearable. Even viewers at home could sense it. Social media timelines lit up in real time. Is she going to respond? Why isn't she saying anything yet? This is brutal. The suspense became its own spectacle, and Crockett's stillness transformed into power. Then, for the briefest second, their eyes locked. DeSantis, expecting to see intimidation, instead found a calm steadiness that unsettled him. His smirk faltered only slightly, but the cameras caught it. The predator, suddenly unsure if he had underestimated his prey. And that was when the escalation reached its peak. Because the silence, the waiting, the restraint, it wasn't avoidance. It was strategy. Crockett had allowed DeSantis to overextend himself, to reveal his hand, to show the country not just arrogance but desperation, disguised as confidence. The longer he spoke, the clearer it became that he wasn't landing blows. He was shadowboxing his own ego. The audience could feel it too. The murmurs grew louder, the whispers sharper. A collective sense that something was about to happen. Crockett leaned forward slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that electrified the room. Reporters raised their pens. The moderators tilted their heads. Even DeSantis paused, mid-sentence, sensing that the balance of power was slipping. And then, still calm, still steady, she parted her lips to speak. The stage was set. The mockery had reached its limit. The tension had been pulled like a bowstring. And the next words, the counterstrike, would not just answer an insult. They would rewrite the night. Because in debates, timing is everything. And Jasmine Crockett's timing was flawless. She sat back in her chair, calm once again, as though she had merely spoken a simple truth. But the impact reverberated like an earthquake. Clips of her words would soon flood timelines, memes would sprout overnight, and hashtags would trend across platforms. But in that instant, before the internet took hold, there was only the silence of a man left speechless by the very person he thought he could diminish. For years, DeSantis had thrived on making others look small. He mocked, he belittled, he dismissed. But on this night, his weapon turned to ash in his hands. Because Jasmine Crockett had taken the insult meant to weaken her and transformed it into a mic-drop moment that stripped his confidence bare. He wasn't just silent, he was exposed, and the audience knew it. They could feel it in the air, taste it in the silence, see it in his eyes. A tide had turned, because sometimes the most devastating counterattack isn't shouted. It's spoken with calm precision, delivered so clearly that there's nowhere left to hide. And for Ron DeSantis, there was no hiding. Not from the cameras, not from the audience, not from the truth Jasmine Crockett had just laid bare. What came next wouldn't just ripple, it would explode. The aftershocks of this moment were about to spread far beyond that room. The pause before Jasmine Crockett spoke stretched like a taut string across the room. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the snap. DeSantis shifted in his chair, the grin still on his face but no longer quite as secure. And then, in a voice calm enough to make the tension even heavier, Crockett began. "You know, Governor," she said, her tone measured, deliberate. "It's interesting how much energy you spend talking about my past. Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing my story proves is that I've been through storms you couldn't even stand in." The audience erupted with murmurs, a few gasps cutting through the silence. Crockett didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her eyes were locked on DeSantis, steady and unflinching. "You call it baggage," she continued, "but I call it survival. I call it resilience. And I call it exactly what makes me qualified to lead, because unlike you, I don't have to pretend to understand what ordinary people live through every single day. I am those people. Their story is mine." Her words fell like hammer blows, each one striking the image DeSantis had tried to build. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but she raised a hand ever so slightly, commanding the room without raising her voice. "And let me tell you something," she said, her tone cooling even further. "Mocking someone's history doesn't erase it. It reveals you. It shows the world that you're so afraid of your own shortcomings. You need to point fingers at someone else's scars. But scars aren't weaknesses. Scars are proof of survival." The room went silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't happen often in politics. Even the moderators, usually quick to interject, stayed quiet, sensing something historic was unfolding. DeSantis shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading as the cameras zoomed in on his face. Crockett, unfazed, pressed on. "You call my past a liability? Let me tell you what liability looks like. Liability looks like arrogance paraded as leadership. Liability looks like someone so detached from real struggle that they think empathy is a weakness. Liability is standing on a stage mocking someone who fought their way here when you've never had to fight for anything but applause." The audience burst into applause, some rising to their feet. Crockett didn't flinch. She let the cheers wash over her, but never broke her gaze. This wasn't about scoring a soundbite. It was about dismantling him piece by piece. "You talk about leadership," she said after the noise calmed. "But leadership isn't about who can throw the sharpest insult. Leadership is about who can stand tall when insulted, who can take every attempt to tear them down and still choose dignity over cruelty." A hush fell again. The words landed like a final blow. DeSantis glanced at the moderators, perhaps hoping for a lifeline, but none came. He reached for a comeback, something, anything that could cut through the moment, but nothing would form. The silence around him was louder than any applause he had ever received, and Crockett wasn't done. "You see, Governor, you're not mocking me. You're mocking every person who's ever been told their past defines them. You're mocking every immigrant who's been told they don't belong. Every kid who grew up with less and was told they'd never matter. Every woman who had to fight twice as hard just to be heard. But here's the thing. You don't get the last word on who we are. We do. And I refuse to let you or anyone else erase the power of survival." The crowd roared this time, unable to contain themselves. The moderators leaned back, letting the moment ride. DeSantis, visibly rattled, adjusted his tie, glanced at his notes, and looked everywhere but at Crockett. She sat back in her chair, calm once again, as though she had merely spoken a simple truth. But the impact reverberated like an earthquake. Clips of her words would soon flood timelines, memes would sprout overnight, and hashtags would trend across platforms. But in that instant, before the internet took hold, there was only the silence of a man left speechless by the very person he thought he could diminish. For years, DeSantis had thrived on making others look small. He mocked, he belittled, he dismissed. But on this night, his weapon turned to ash in his hands. Because Jasmine Crockett had taken the insult meant to weaken her and transformed it into a mic-drop moment that stripped his confidence bare. He wasn't just silent, he was exposed, and the audience knew it. They could feel it in the air, taste it in the silence, see it in his eyes. A tide had turned, because sometimes the most devastating counterattack isn't shouted. It's spoken with calm precision, delivered so clearly that there's nowhere left to hide, and for Ron DeSantis, there was no hiding. Not from the cameras, not from the audience, not from the truth Jasmine Crockett had just laid bare. What came next wouldn't just ripple, it would explode. The aftershocks of this moment were about to spread far beyond that room. The debate stage exhaled a silence so sharp it felt like glass. For a split second, the cameras caught everything. The tightness in DeSantis's jaw, the restless shifting of his hands, the widening eyes of the moderators who seemed unsure whether to step in or simply let the wreckage speak for itself. Then, like thunder after a lightning strike, the room erupted. Applause swelled into a roar. Not the polite kind that follows a rehearsed talking point, but the visceral, involuntary reaction of people witnessing a shift in power. The sound ricocheted across the chamber, rolling over DeSantis like a wave he couldn't control. He forced a smile, but it was brittle, hollow, a mask cracking under pressure. Crockett, meanwhile, didn't bask. She didn't even blink. She sat back, composed, letting the energy in the room confirm what had just happened. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was ownership. In politics, timing is everything, and she knew the power of letting applause become the punctuation. Viewers at home felt it too. Phones buzzed as clips were cut in real time, spreading across feeds like wildfire. "Did you see Crockett?" became the question of the night. Hashtags began to climb. Your mic drop. Crockett strong. DeSantis silent. Every replay amplified the same image. DeSantis shrinking while Crockett expanded, her presence filling the screen. But inside the room, the human reactions told the story even louder than the screens. A woman in the audience wiped away tears. A young man nodded vigorously, whispering to the person beside him. Even some political operatives, seasoned, hardened, usually immune to the drama, leaned forward with raised eyebrows, recognizing that history had just pivoted on a sentence. DeSantis finally tried to recover, fumbling for his notes, attempting to pivot to policy, to numbers, to the familiar rhythm of control. But the spell was broken. Each word sounded thinner than the last, the conviction gone. The cameras no longer lingered on him. They darted back to Crockett, waiting for her slightest glance, her next move, and she knew it. She didn't need to say more. Her restraint, her refusal to pile on, spoke volumes. She had already delivered the blow. Now she let the silence echo. In politics, overplaying your hand can undo the victory. Crockett, with the discipline of someone who understood power, simply folded her hands, as if to say, "I've said enough." The world heard me. The moderators shuffled their cards, grasping for composure. They moved on to the next question, but it hardly mattered. The narrative had already been written, and it wasn't theirs to control anymore. The room was still vibrating from the force of what had just unfolded. Outside, the ripple effect grew. Commentators scrambled to update their takes. Headlines were rewritten mid-draft. Pundits who had predicted a smooth night for DeSantis now pivoted with visible shock. Unprepared, dismantled, outclassed, the descriptors poured in. For Crockett, the language was different. Unyielding, sharp, historic. And yet beyond the punditry and the spin, there was something deeper happening. In living rooms across the country, people who had felt unseen sat a little taller. Immigrants who had been mocked for their accents, women who had been dismissed for their ambition, workers who carried scars from struggle. All of them recognized themselves in Crockett's defiance. She wasn't just answering DeSantis. She was answering every insult they'd ever swallowed in silence. That was the real shockwave, the way her words translated beyond the stage. This wasn't politics as usual. This was personal. DeSantis, still speaking, still gesturing, seemed unaware of how far the ground had shifted beneath him. He was talking, but no one was listening. Crockett had already taken the oxygen out of the room, and when the segment finally ended, the moderator's voice a little tighter than before, the applause returned, not for the transition, not for the process, but for her, Crockett. The sound rose once more, and this time it wasn't just appreciation. It was vindication. The night would be remembered not for the policies debated or the statistics rattled off, but for the moment one woman transformed an insult into a declaration of strength, leaving a powerful man searching for words that would never come. And as the lights caught her face, steady and serene, it was clear. Jasmine Crockett had shifted from participant to protagonist. This was her stage now. The shock waves were only beginning. When the applause finally dimmed and the cameras shifted to commercial breaks, something lingered in the air. Something beyond politics, beyond parties, beyond the theatrics of a single debate night. What Jasmine Crockett had done was more than defend herself. She had turned mockery into meaning, insult into instruction, and in doing so she had reminded America of a truth too often forgotten. Dignity is not a weakness. It is a force. In her composure, she reframed the very idea of strength. DeSantis came armed with barbs meant to wound, with a tone sharpened to slice through respectability. Yet it was Crockett's calm, the weight of her lived experience, and her refusal to be diminished that transformed the exchange. She proved that in a world obsessed with volume, true authority is measured not by how loud you shout, but by how deeply your words land. Her story resonated because it was never just hers. Every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every woman who had been interrupted or talked over, every worker whose worth had been questioned, they all heard themselves in her voice. Crockett didn't just push back for herself. She pushed back for them. That was the moral center of the night. And in that, she revealed something larger about America itself. The nation has always been torn between two competing visions. One rooted in exclusion, hierarchy, and nostalgia for a past that never truly existed. The other grounded in resilience, renewal, and the belief that progress comes when the underestimated rise. On that stage, the battle played out in miniature. DeSantis tried to cast Crockett as less experienced, less worthy, less American. But her response showed that the true measure of Americanness isn't ancestry or pedigree. It's the courage to stand unflinching in the face of contempt and say, I belong. I matter. I will not be erased. The lesson was unmistakable. Power rooted in arrogance is fleeting. Power grounded in dignity endures. That night, Crockett carried herself with a stillness that exposed bluster as hollow. She showed that when truth is spoken plainly, with conviction earned through lived struggle, it pierces more sharply than any insult could. And the ripple of that moment did more than humble a political rival. It inspired a wider recognition that America is strongest when voices like hers are not just heard but amplified. That the future doesn't belong to those who cling to mockery as a weapon, but to those who wield dignity as a shield. The cameras may have moved on, but the image of her sitting steady, her words reverberating long after they were spoken, etched itself into memory. It wasn't merely a debate, it was a declaration. A reminder that history bends not when the powerful scoff, but when the underestimated refuse to bow. Her response will be replayed, analyzed, celebrated. But beneath all the commentary, its enduring moral is simple. In the struggle between derision and dignity, it is dignity that defines history. And that night, Jasmine Crockett made history. And so, as the lights dimmed on that debate stage, the story that lingered wasn't Ron DeSantis's insult. It was Jasmine Crockett's response. A single exchange became a defining moment, proof that arrogance can be silenced and dignity can roar without raising its voice. What viewers witnessed wasn't just politics. It was a reminder of what resilience looks like when it refuses to bend, when it stares down mockery and transforms it into a rallying cry. This wasn't just Crockett versus DeSantis. It was a reflection of us, of a country wrestling with who gets to claim the mantle of Americanness, who gets to be respected, who gets to lead. And on that night, it was clear, the future doesn't belong to the sneers of the past. It belongs to those who rise, who refuse to be shamed into silence, who remind us that strength is not cruelty, but courage. That is why her words matter. That is why her composure matters. Because when one voice stands against mockery and refuses to fall, millions watching at home remember that they, too, can rise. And if you felt that moment, if you saw yourself in her calm, if you recognized your own story in her defiance, then this is your call. Don't let it end here. Share this story, subscribe to this channel, and join a community that refuses to let arrogance define us. Together, we amplify the voices that stand tall. We celebrate the courage that silences mockery, and we carry forward the truth that dignity always outlasts derision. Because in the end, this wasn't just a debate. It was a declaration, and declarations only matter if we answer them.